Imagine you're holding a bag of ordinary salt in your hand. Cheap, everyday, boring. Now, forget everything you think you know about it. This is a story called The Salt Road of Tartaria, why ordinary salt was worth its weight in gold. Because once, for a handful of salt, people gave up land, freedom, and life. And it wasn't just a spice, it was a key. When I started tracing the old salt roads, something felt wrong. They didn't stretch out like random traders' paths, but like a precise network, from star-shaped forts to strange domed cities, where giant basins, wells, and underground tunnels stood right next to the salt depots. Official history says it was just trade and taxes. But the maps, the plans, and the old photos whisper something else. As if salt was feeding something bigger. Water machines, pressure, the energy of an entire world that someone later worked very hard to erase from memory. If that's true, then we didn't just underestimate salt. We failed to notice the skeleton of a forgotten civilization beneath our roads. So, the main question is simple and terrifying. Who and why turned the Salt Road of Tartaria from the energy artery of the old world into a cheap white powder sitting on a supermarket shelf? I was not looking for a lost civilization. I was looking for salt. It began, like many strange stories do, with a map I was never meant to notice. A 19th century trade chart, brittle and fading, buried in a university archive and labeled with one dry line. Principal salt routes of the Eastern Territories, 1847. I expected donkeys, dirt roads, a few merchant caravans winding through mountains. The usual picture our school books paint for us. What I found instead felt like a glitch in the timeline. The routes did not meander like trade paths. They ran straight, impossibly straight. They linked points that should have had nothing in common. Star-shaped fortresses, domed cities, enormous basins carved into the earth. And at every junction, every crossing, every node, there was a salt depot. Not small warehouses, not modest storage sheds, palaces. Ask yourself something. Why would anyone build a fortress with precise geometric walls, defensive towers, and deep underground chambers just to store table salt? Why would these trade routes line up so perfectly that you could lay a ruler across them for hundreds of miles and never leave the path? Why did the cities along these lines look less like markets and more like machines laid out on a drawing board? The official explanation is simple. We have heard it since childhood. Salt was valuable. It preserved food. Kings taxed it. The end. But that neat little story snapped the moment I started measuring. The more I compared the lines, the less it looked like trade and the more it looked like design. I pulled up satellite imagery of the old salt cities. Wieliczka, Salzburg, Cardona, Aigues Mortes, places that history books file under medieval salt towns. Then I overlaid them on the 1847 map. They matched. Perfectly, not roughly, not close enough. Down to the walls, down to the wells, down to the underground tunnels that official records insist were not built until the industrial age. Something was wrong, because these structures, these clean, precisely aligned, impossibly advanced complexes, were not thrown together by peasants hauling sacks of salt. They were not simple tax stations for local kings counting coins. They felt inherited, and that was the moment I understood what I was really looking at. Not trade routes, not medieval commerce, not a simple story about food preservation. No. I was looking at the skeleton of something much older, something that used salt not as a product, but as a component, a key, a piece of machinery we no longer know how to read. The closer you study the pattern, the more it seems that someone erased this system on purpose. Depots renamed as warehouses, fortresses relabeled as customs houses. And it's an entire network quietly downgraded from technology to local tradition. But the maps do not lie. The geometry does not lie. And the salt, silent, white, and hiding in plain sight, does not lie either. Before we go deeper, and we are going much deeper, I need to ask you something. If you are watching this, you are one of the few people who actually wants the truth. Not the comfortable version. Not the neat textbook summary. The real thing. I do not make these videos for the algorithm. I make them because what I have found deserves to be seen, to be questioned, to exist somewhere other than a forgotten shelf in an archive. So, if this resonates with you, if you feel that pull towards what has been hidden, subscribe, hit the bell, Because this series is only beginning, and what comes next will change how you see every map, every fortress, every grain of salt you used to ignore. Now, let us talk about the price. Because if salt was really just salt, just a seasoning, just a preservative, why did it cost more than gold? Why were wars fought over it? Why were families destroyed for smuggling it? And why did empires rise and fall based on who controlled those straight, geometric, impossibly precise roads? Which raises the biggest question of all. What were they really protecting? To understand what they were protecting, you first have to understand what salt really meant. Not to us, to them. We think of salt as cheap, ordinary, something you grab off a supermarket shelf without a second thought. But for most of human history, salt was something else entirely. It was power. In ancient Rome, soldiers were not paid only in coins. They were paid in salt. The word salary comes from salarium, the salt ration given to Roman legions. If you controlled the salt, you controlled the army. If you held the army, you held the empire. But Rome was only the beginning. In medieval Europe, rulers taxed salt so hard that entire families were destroyed for smuggling a few handfuls across a border. In France, the gabelle, the royal salt tax, funded wars, raised palaces, and helped push people toward revolution. Men and women were imprisoned, executed, whole villages burned to the ground for salt. Ask yourself, does that sound like a reaction to food seasoning? The records are clear. In 13th century Venice, a single pound of salt could cost the equivalent of a month's wages for a common laborer. In parts of Africa, salt was traded ounce for ounce with gold, not metaphorically, literally. You could place a bag of salt on one side of the scale, a bag of gold on the other, and they balanced. In Tibet, bricks of salt were used as currency well into the 20th century. In Ethiopia, salt bars called amole served as money for over 1,000 years. This was not simple commerce. This was control. Yet here is what the history books do not explain. Why? Why would any single substance, no matter how useful, command that kind of value? That level of violence? That obsessive empire-wide need to regulate every grain? Preservation? Yes, salt keeps meat from rotting. But you can also dry meat. You can smoke fish. You can ferment vegetables. Humans survived for tens of thousands of years without industrial salt networks. Flavor? Spices were costly too, but nobody wiped out families for smuggling pepper. So no, the true value of salt was something else. Something the official story circles around, but never quite names. And here is the strangest part. The places where salt was most brutally controlled were not random dots on a map. They were nodes. I started mapping the locations of the worst salt conflicts, the harshest taxes, the most rigid monopolies, and a pattern emerged that I could not unsee. The Wieliczka salt mines in Poland, held by royalty for over 700 years, with underground chambers that look more like cathedrals than caves. The salt springs of Reichenhall in Bavaria, fortified like military bases, linked by pipelines that official timelines claim were not possible until modern engineering. The salt flats of Gironde in France, framed by geometric canals, ancient basins, and walls that seem older than any recorded construction. These were not scattered resources taxed for simple profit. They were strategic points, choke points. As if someone knew that controlling these exact locations meant gripping something far larger than trade. The violence was not only about greed, it was about access. And the deeper I looked into who was doing the controlling, royal dynasties, church authorities, early nation states, the more something unsettling came into focus. None of them built these systems, they inherited them. The fortresses were already standing, the pipelines were already laid, the underground networks were already carved. The new rulers simply moved in, nailed their flags to ancient stone, and started charging tolls for something they had not created and did not fully understand. It is as if they found the keys to a machine and realized that whoever held the keys held the power, but they did not build the machine. So who did? And what was the machine actually for? Because if salt was only about preserving meat and paying soldiers, you do not need star-shaped fortresses. You do not need underground cathedrals. You do not need geometric canal systems stretching across whole regions and continents. You need that kind of infrastructure for something else entirely. something that moves, something that flows, something that depends on pressure, precision, and nodes spread out over vast distances. Which brings us to the stations, the places where the salt roads converged, the buildings that official history calls depots and warehouses. But that look, once you finally see them clearly, like something very different, something that moves, something that flows, something that needs pressure, accuracy, and nodes spread across a map. That was when I remembered my earlier research. Months before, I had been digging into the grand railway stations of the 19th century, those impossible buildings that seemed to appear almost overnight across Europe and America. Terminals that were too beautiful, too advanced, too perfectly engineered for the era that supposedly created them. Back then, I had noticed something I could not explain. Many of those stations sat at the very ends of old salt routes. At the time, I waved it away as coincidence. Railways follow trade paths follow salt. Simple logistics, end of story. But now, with the map of salt fortresses burning in my mind, I went back and checked again, and the coincidence snapped into a clear pattern. Vienna's Südbahnhof, built directly on the site of an ancient salt depot. Leipzig's Hauptbahnhof, placed exactly where 3 salt roads once met like spokes of a wheel. The grand stations of Krakow, Budapest, Milan, all of them planted right on top of older salt infrastructure, not just near it, not close to the old salt nodes, on them, precisely on them, as if someone was deliberately grafting the new system onto the bones of the old one. But what truly broke my understanding was not the rail lines. It was the salt depots themselves. In my head, I had pictured warehouses, practical buildings, wooden sheds with loading docks, and simple storage rooms stacked with sacks. What I found in the archives looked nothing like that. The salt stations of the 18th and 19th centuries were cathedrals, massive stone complexes with vaulted ceilings that soared 3, 4, even 5 stories high, underground levels that plunged deep into the earth, central halls with strange acoustic properties that modern engineers still struggle to fully explain. In Salins-les-Bains, in France, the Royal Salt Works looks like a temple compound. Semicircular colonnades, rigorously planned gardens, a central structure that resembles an ancient observatory more than a factory. In Wieliczka, in Poland, the underground salt chambers hold carved chapels, chandeliers made of crystallized salt, and halls so vast they can host concerts and weddings. In Cardona, in Spain, the salt mountain is crowned by a fortress monastery that predates any written record of its construction, as if it has simply always been there. These were not warehouses. They were not mere storage facilities. They were something else entirely, with intent built into every wall, every arch, every precisely calculated angle. And the floor plans, when I finally uncovered them, confirmed what I had begun to suspect. These buildings were not laid out to stockpile salt. They were designed to process something, central chambers with raised platforms, channels carved into the stone floors, ventilation systems that should not exist in supposedly medieval architecture, basins set at exact heights, linked by pipes that ran underground for miles. The official explanation labels all of this as brine evaporation systems. But evaporation does not require tuned acoustic halls. It does not demand geometric precision. It does not need buildings that read like diagrams of machines masquerading as architecture. Unless evaporation was never the main purpose, unless the salt was never the final product, unless these stations were doing something with salt and water and pressure that we have completely forgotten, or been made to forget. I kept staring at the floor plans, the channels, the basins, the underground connections that tied one chamber to another, and slowly, a different picture began to form. Not stations, not depots, not warehouses, nodes, processing nodes in a vast hydraulic network that used brine, salt water, as its working fluid, which meant the salt roads were not just roads, they were arteries. And the question was no longer what the salt was for. The question was, what was the network feeding? What was the network feeding? To even start answering that, I had to stop staring at roads and start staring at water. Because the more I studied the old salt maps, the more I saw something that did not fit the simple trade route story. The paths did not just cross land, they clung to rivers, to canals, to channels that slipped through valleys and then vanished underground. At first I told myself this was practical. Water transport is easier than hauling on land. Boats carry more than donkeys. That is the standard explanation. Simple economics. But when I examined the canals themselves, simple economics stopped explaining anything. Take the Canal de la Sourdre in France, officially built in the 17th century to move salt from the Atlantic coast. It's straight, sections run for miles like drawn lines on paper. The locks are so advanced that even mainstream historians admit they were unusually sophisticated for their time. And at every major junction stand the same cathedral-like structures I had already seen tied to salt. Monumental buildings, not humble docks. Or look at the Salzach River corridor in Austria, linking salt mines to processing centers through a mesh of channels, tunnels, and engineered waterways. Some stretches are cut clean through mountain rock, others run underground for kilometers before surfacing at a fortified salt station, complete with walls and towers. Then there are the brine pipelines of Reichenhall, wooden tubes carrying salt water over mountains and across valleys, through pressure systems that the official timeline says should not have been possible before the industrial age. The first documents appear in the 16th century, yet the level of engineering hints at something much older, as if the records began halfway through the story. I kept following this line of evidence, and instead of ending, it widened. In England, the salt towns of Cheshire sit above a web of underground brine channels, some natural, some clearly carved, and some no one can properly explain. Local legends talk about salt rivers flowing beneath the ground long before any recorded mining began. In China, the Zhejiang salt wells used bamboo pipelines and natural gas in the 3rd century, drilling methods Western engineers would not discover for another 1,500 years. In the Carpathian Mountains, ancient salt springs are ringed by carved stone channels that lead into basins, then into secondary channels, and finally into underground systems that have never been fully surveyed. This was not random. This was not scattered, primitive communities stumbling on salt and slowly learning how to move it. This was engineering, sophisticated, deliberate, and connected on a scale that stretches across regions and continents. And the most unsettling detail? The salt depots did not just sit at the ends of these water systems. They were placed exactly where water pressure would peak, where steep drops, bends, or sudden elevation changes could generate force, where the physics of flowing brine would create maximum energy. I began overlaying depot locations on the topographical maps, and the pattern stopped being guesswork. Every major salt station sat at a pressure point, not a trading point, a pressure point. It was as if the entire network, the canals, the rivers, the subterranean channels, the brine pipelines, had never been designed mainly to move salt from mine to market. It had been designed to move energy, salt water running downhill, pressure building in underground chambers, force traveling through channels into stations that took that raw power and converted it into something. I did not yet know what that something was, but I knew where the next clue would be, because the architecture, the geometry, the almost impossible precision of these nodes, I had seen it before, in old engravings, in forgotten atlases, in descriptions of a civilization that official history insists never existed. The same word kept appearing in the margins. Tartaria, Tartaria. The word felt strange in my mouth, like a name the world had been trained to unlearn. I had seen it before, of course, on old maps labeled Grande Tartarie, a vast landmass stretching across half of Asia. In 18th century encyclopedias that calmly described a huge empire which somehow does not survive into modern school books. In scattered online discussions that mainstream historians brush aside with a tired wave of the hand. But I was not looking for Tartaria. Tartaria found me. It started with an atlas, a French atlas from the year 1737, buried in a digital archive describing the Great Eastern Salt Road as a principal trade artery of the Tartarian Empire. Not China, not Russia, not the Mongols. Tartaria. The text listed cities I had never heard of, fortifications built around salt springs, a chain of hydraulic stations that supplied the empire with, and here the translation turned slippery, the white blood of the earth. White blood. Salt. I kept digging. In German engineering journals from the early 1820s, I found references to Tartarische Zollwerke, Tartarian Salt Works, written with a mix of respect and confusion. The authors could not understand how such advanced brine systems existed in regions they casually labeled barbaric and undeveloped. In Russian geological surveys from the 1840s, I read reports of underground salt chambers in the Urals with architecture of unknown origin, vaulted ceilings, sharp geometric carvings, acoustic effects so intense that the surveyors themselves admitted the spaces made them uneasy. In British travel accounts from the 1860s, I saw sketches of salt springs in Central Asia ringed by ruins, domed buildings, star-shaped foundations, basins connected by channels that dove straight into the earth. The travelers all repeated the same line. The locals did not build this. The locals did not know who did. The structures were simply there. Ancient, silent, waiting. When I finally gathered enough drawings and photographs to compare, the architecture told its own story. It matched the domed roofs, the strict geometric layouts, the same tight relationship between water, salt, and deep underground chambers. Wieliczka in Poland, Salins-les-Bains in France, Cardona in Spain, Reichenhall in Germany, and now these nameless ruins scattered across what the old atlases called the Tartarian heartland. Same design language, same system logic, same purpose. Separated by thousands of miles, yet linked by something official history refuses to name. A civilization that built with salt and water, not just stone and wood. That laid out hydraulic networks across entire continents. That clearly understood something about pressure, flow, and energy that we have either forgotten or been encouraged to forget. The engravings I found showed cities I could not locate on any modern map. Grand arches rising directly over salt springs, towers capped with spherical domes clustered around central basins, streets radiating outward in perfect geometric patterns. The same star-shaped layouts I had already traced in European salt fortresses. These were not primitive nomads. These were not scattered, isolated tribes. This looked like a unified civilization whose engineering knowledge stretched from the Atlantic coast to the Pacific shores. And then, somewhere between the old atlases and the modern textbooks, it was gone. Not slowly, not through a gentle decline. It was erased. The maps were redrawn. The place names were swapped out. The empire that once controlled the salt roads was pushed into the margins as a vague label, a blank zone, a word that now sounds almost like a joke when you say it out loud. Tartaria. But the architecture stayed. The salt station stayed. The network, fractured, forgotten, repurposed, stayed. And I was standing on its bones, which meant it was time to zoom out, to look at the entire pattern at once, to trace the grid that someone, at some point, had worked very hard to bury. To see the full picture, I had to stop looking at individual points and start looking at the pattern they formed together. I gathered every salt station I had documented, every fortress, every cathedral-like depot, every underground chamber and hydraulic node. Then I pinned them all onto a single map. What appeared on that map made my hands shake. This was not just a loose network. This was a grid. The major salt cities of Europe, Salzburg, Wieliczka, Cardona, Salins, Reichenhall, Lüneburg, Droitwich, did not cluster randomly around deposits. They lined up. They created angles. They formed geometric relationships no natural, organic trade system would ever produce by accident. I drew a line from Wieliczka to Salzburg, perfectly straight, nearly 500 kilometers. I drew another from Salzburg to Cardona. The angle between them was exact, sharp, deliberate, like someone had used a compass and ruler on the continent itself. Then I connected Lüneburg to Reichenhall, Droitwich to Salins, Aigues-Mortes to the Carpathian Springs. The lines kept crossing at points I had never bothered to study. Cities I had written off as unimportant, towns that modern history books barely give a single sentence. But when I checked those intersection points, every single one, I found the same pattern. Old salt works, underground chambers, ruins of geometric buildings, local legends about ancient wells and white springs that stretched back beyond any living memory. This grid was not accidental, it was designed. Someone, a very long time ago, had mapped Europe's salt deposits and then built a system linking them with mathematical precision. Not for simple trade. Trade does not require straight lines across mountains. Trade does not care about exact angles between distant cities. You build a grid like this when you are moving something that obeys strict physical laws, something that needs stable pressure, stable height differences, stable distances between nodes. You build a grid like this for energy. I overlaid the salt grid onto geological maps, onto elevation charts, onto hydrological diagrams showing underground water systems and aquifers. The fit was impossible to ignore. The grid followed the water. Every line ran through regions of high groundwater pressure. Every node sat where underground aquifers crossed or rose toward the surface. Every salt station was positioned to capture not just the mineral itself, but the force of water moving inside the earth. This was not medieval guesswork. This was not a clever Renaissance upgrade. This felt older. Something that understood Europe's hidden hydrology with a clarity modern geologists are only now beginning to approach with satellites and computer models. A system that treated an entire continent like a single machine. And we have been living on top of it, walking its roads, posing for photos at its tourist sites, drinking from its springs, without ever really seeing what it was built to do. But seeing the grid raised a new question, one I had been quietly avoiding. If salt and water can be combined to move energy, how does that actually work? How does it actually work? I am not an engineer. I am not a physicist. But the question would not let me go. If the salt network was designed to move energy, not just goods, then there had to be a mechanism, a principle, a reason why salt water would matter more than ordinary water. So I started reading old engineering manuals with yellowed pages, hydraulic textbooks that nobody borrows anymore, forgotten papers on the behavior of brine in the pipes and wells. And then I found it. Salt water is heavier than fresh water, roughly 2 to 3% denser, depending on how much salt you dissolve in it. On paper, that difference looks tiny. It sounds like nothing. But in a hydraulic system, that tiny difference changes everything. Imagine two vertical columns of water, side by side, connected at the bottom. One is filled with fresh water, the other with brine. The heavier salt water pushes down. The lighter fresh water is forced up. You get movement, you get flow, you get a pressure difference you can use. No pumps, no engines, no external power source at all. Just salt, water, and gravity doing the work. This is basic physics. Engineers today call it density-driven flow. It is the same principle behind certain kinds of wells, some cooling systems, even parts of the great ocean currents that circle the planet. But here is what stopped me cold. The old salt stations were built exactly to exploit this principle. Deep brine wells tied into elevated basins, underground channels running from low salt, springs up toward higher reservoirs, chambers laid out to separate heavy, concentrated brine from lighter, diluted water. The architecture I had been staring at for months was not just beautiful, it was functional. Those vaulted ceilings, they were not only for show, they created temperature differences between high and low air layers, and with that, small pressure changes that helped move air and moisture. Those underground channels, they did more than drain water. They linked high salinity sources to low salinity outlets, setting up natural circulation loops. Those vast central basins, they were not just pools. They were mixing chambers, precisely placed so that changes in density would produce a constant, gentle push. A continuous flow that never really stopped as long as water and salt were present. I found diagrams from the 18th century showing brine lifting systems that use no mechanical power at all. No water wheels, no engines, just careful control of salt, concentration at different depths, and clever placement of pipes. I found descriptions of self-flowing wells that seemed to pump water uphill, something that sounds impossible by normal intuition. Unless you understand how brine density can be turned into a tool, I found engineering curiosities that historians had labeled unexplained or simply exaggerated reports. But the moment you apply the salt principle, they stop being mysteries. They start looking like case studies from a lost textbook. The network was not only moving salt from place to place, it was using salt to move everything else. Water, pressure, force, energy. And when I combined that idea with the scale of the grid, the continental layout, the thousands of nodes, the underground links crossing mountain ranges, a new picture started to form, one that made my head spin. This was not just infrastructure. This was a power system, a system that ran on brine, on gravity, and on geometry. A system someone had designed, someone had maintained, someone had fully understood, and then, at some point, someone had taken it apart. Because if this system was real, if it genuinely worked the way the clues suggest, then the stations were not just nodes on a map, they were power plants, which meant I had to look at them again from the ground up, not as salt depots, not as simple warehouses, as palaces, as temples, as machines disguised in the clothing of architecture. Machines dressed in the clothing of architecture. That phrase kept echoing in my mind as I began revisiting the most famous salt sites, not as a tourist sees them, not as a guidebook describes them, as an investigator hunting for the mechanism hidden beneath the beauty. My first stop was the Royal Salt Works at Arc-et-Seignans in France. The official story calls it a visionary industrial project designed by architect Claude Nicolas Ledoux in the 1770s. A bold, semicircular complex built for salt production, revolutionary for its time. But the closer I studied the plans, the less industrial it looked. The central director's house sits at the focus of a perfect half circle. 11 buildings radiate outward like spokes on a wheel. The proportions are exact. The layout is deliberate. The whole thing feels less like a factory and more like a ritual diagram drawn onto the landscape. And at the very center, directly beneath the director's house, the archives mention underground chambers that were sealed in the 19th century. Chambers whose purpose was never recorded. No diagrams, no notes. Just a quiet line. Closed and filled. Why would a salt works need sealed subsurface rooms at its geometric heart? From France I moved east, to Wieliczka. Here, 9 levels descend more than 300 meters into the earth. Chapels carved entirely from salt. Chandeliers of crystallized brine. Chambers so vast they contain underground lakes. Dark pools of salt water that no one has fully explained. Tourists gasp at the scenery. Guides talk about the religious devotion and artistic spirit of medieval miners. But miners do not normally carve tuned acoustic chambers. Miners do not shape underground ballrooms with precise geometric floor patterns. Miners do not spend time creating spaces that amplify certain frequencies of sound and swallow others. These were not just mines, they were something else, wearing the mask of mines. Then I turned to Cardona in Spain, a salt mountain, an entire hill of solid salt, crowned by a fortress monastery complex whose origins reach back more than 1,000 years. Officially, the fortress existed to guard the valuable resource beneath it. But the fortress sits exactly at the apex of the salt dome, the geometric center, the one point where, if you were designing a pressure system, you would place your main regulator, your master valve. Coincidence? I stopped believing in coincidences months ago. Everywhere I looked, the same pattern repeated. Salt palaces set down with mathematical precision. Underground chambers aligned not to whim, but to faults, domes, and other geological features. Surface architecture that mirrors an invisible infrastructure below, like a reflection of the machine hidden underground. And always, always, the same Tartarian fingerprints, star-shaped foundations, domed central buildings, radial symmetry, water basins built directly into the plan, not as decoration, but as structural elements. These complexes were not built by the kingdoms that later stamped their coats of arms on the walls. They were found, occupied, renamed, and then, slowly and deliberately, stripped of their original function. Which leads to an uncomfortable question. If these structures were inherited, if later rulers simply moved into someone else's system, then who was the real builder? And why, after all this searching, can I not find their names anywhere? Why can't I find their names anywhere? That question started as a quiet annoyance. Then it became an obsession. Every great structure in history has a builder. The pyramids have competing theories and lists of possible architects. Cathedrals have master masons whose names are carved into stone. Railways have engineers whose biographies fill entire textbooks. But the salt network? The hydraulic grid stretching across Europe and beyond? Silence. I went looking for the architects of Wieliczka's underground chapels. The official record simply describes the mines as developed over centuries by generations of miners. No master builder, no original plan, No engineering drawings for the vast chambers carved with almost surgical precision. I dug into the history of arc-et-seigneurs. Claude Nicolas Ledoux is credited as the visionary architect, but only for the surface layout, the elegant semicircle, the facades. When it comes to the underground chambers beneath the director's house, the files go blank. No architect listed, no construction dates. Just a dry note saying they already existed when Ledoux arrived on site. Then I checked the engineers behind the Reichenhall brine pipelines. Officially, the system is attributed to local craftsmen and gradual improvements over time. Yet the pipelines depend on precise calculations of pressure, elevation, and flow across mountain terrain. The kind of math the mainstream timeline tells us did not exist until the 19th century. And still, those pipes were already working in the 16th century. So, who designed them? The deeper I dug, the stranger the pattern became. Construction records for major salt works across Europe share the same unsettling feature. They list completion dates. They list royal orders and funding. They go into detail on renovations, expansions, and modernizations. But they almost never describe the original build. It is as if the core structures simply appeared and the written story starts halfway through. And the few names that do appear, the engineers and architects credited with creating these systems, began to feel wrong the more I compared them. I started cross-referencing. The same small group of names appears in multiple countries, across multiple decades. Projects separated by thousands of miles and overlapping years are all attributed to the same individuals. One German engineer is said to have designed salt works in Bavaria, Poland, and Transylvania within a span of time that would have required impossible travel and constant work with no break. One French architect shows up in Burgundy, Provence, and the Pyrenees on projects whose construction dates collide with each other. Either these men had supernatural stamina and teleportation, or their names were added later, pasted onto structures that needed a human origin story, a face to attach to something that had no clear beginning in the written record. I found entire phases of construction summarized in a single vague sentence. Works were completed as designed. The system was implemented successfully. Improvements were made according to plan. No description of how deep shafts were sunk. No notes on how pressure problems were solved. No mention of failures, redesigns, or accidents. The things real engineering projects always generate. Just clean, empty phrases where the struggle should be. It felt less like missing information, and more like information had been scrubbed, as if someone wanted these structures to have official builders, but could not supply them. So they invented names, recycled credentials, created a paper trail that loops back on itself and leads nowhere. The silence around the true engineers was not just a gap, it behaved like a cover, and covers exist for one reason: to hide what was really there. To hide what was really there. That is what a cover is for. But covers eventually crack, and sometimes the truth leaks out in the least expected places. I found it in war records, not in the famous campaigns, not in the grand conquests that fill school books, but in the small, ugly conflicts, written off as footnotes: the salt riots, the tax rebellions, the bursts of brutal local violence that historians shrug away as peasants getting angry about seasoning. I started cataloging them. The Gay Bell revolts in France, centuries of resistance to salt taxes that killed thousands and shook entire regions. The Salt March in India, remembered today as Gandhi's great protest, but built on generations of earlier uprisings against British salt monopolies that had already crushed local communities. The Salt War of 1540 in Perugia, when the Pope sent troops to enforce control over salt, and the city was devastated for daring to refuse. The more I listed, the longer it got. Hundreds of conflicts, thousands of deaths, whole populations displaced, imprisoned, executed over salt. The official explanation never sat right with me. Yes, salt was taxed. Yes, harsh taxes cause unrest. But the response, the military response, was always wildly out of proportion. Armies mobilized, cities besieged, villages burned, massacres carried out. For a condiment? So, I started mapping the conflicts, and a pattern emerged that made me stop. The violence clustered around the nodes, not around every salt deposit, not around random mines or coastal flats, around the specific stations I had already identified. the hydraulic nodes, the pressure points of the ancient grid. Whenever a local population tried to claim these places for itself, whenever community control threatened the distant center, the reaction was immediate and overwhelming, not gentle tax enforcement, removal. The salt wars were not about a few coins of revenue, they were about access control. Someone, the church, the crowns, the rising nation-states, understood that these nodes were strategic, not just economically strategic, systemically strategic. Control the nodes, control the network. Lose the nodes, lose the system. I found records of salt works being destroyed rather than surrendered. Channels deliberately collapsed, wells choked with rubble, entire stations blown apart or pulled down stone by stone when they could no longer be held. This was not how merchants protect stock. This was scorched earth, the behavior of someone defending something far more valuable than trade goods. And the most disturbing pattern of all, after each conflict, after each salt rebellion was crushed, the stations were rebuilt, repaired, put back into operation, but under tighter, more centralized control. The infrastructure was worth saving. The people were not. That contrast told me everything about the true priorities behind these wars, and it hinted at what had to come next. Because systems this valuable do not simply fade out by accident. They are dismantled on purpose. They get dismantled on purpose. I knew the network existed. I knew it had value. I knew it had been violently defended for centuries. So, why did it stop? The answer was not in the construction records. It was hiding in the demolition orders. I began to find them in municipal archives, provincial files, royal decrees from the late 19th and early 20th centuries, orders to modernize salt facilities, orders to rationalize brine production, orders to update infrastructure according to contemporary standards, bureaucratic language, dry, forgettable. But the photographs told a different story. I found before and after images of salt stations across Europe, and what they showed was not simple progress. It was systematic destruction wearing the mask of improvement. In Lorraine, a magnificent domed salt works, complete with underground chambers and geometric basins, was torn down in 1892 and replaced with a flat, anonymous industrial block. Official reason: structural instability. In Bavaria, ancient brine channels were filled with concrete in 1907. Pipelines that had worked for centuries were declared obsolete and sealed. The engineering documents for the original system simply disappeared from the record. In Poland, upper levels of the Wieliczka complex were closed to the public and partially collapsed in the 1880s. The official explanation blamed natural settling. Yet the photographs show clean cuts in load-bearing structures, controlled breaks, deliberate removals. This was not decay. This was surgery. Someone was cutting the network apart with precision, severing links, filling channels, collapsing key chambers, and they were doing it everywhere. At the same historical moment, France, Germany, Austria, Poland, Spain, England. Within a single generation, from roughly 1880 to 1920, the continental salt network was gutted, domes removed, basins drained, star-shaped foundations buried under new construction, underground systems sealed, and their access points hidden or bricked over. Then came the relabeling. Ancient hydraulic stations were rebranded as historical monuments. Active nodes became tourist attractions. Working infrastructure was recast as cultural heritage. The buildings stayed standing, but their function was stripped away. Their purpose was erased. They were turned into picturesque shells for visitors who would never be told what they were really standing inside. The story of salt was rewritten. No more hydraulic networks, no more continental grid, no more energy system, just trade, just taxes, just food preservation. A technology was downgraded into a commodity. A civilization was squeezed into a footnote, and the machine that had once powered something large and unnamed was quietly unplugged piece by piece until only the skeleton remained. But bones remember, stones remember. And some places, the ones they could not completely destroy, still echo with what they once were. And some places still echo with what they once were. I needed to find out if that was really true. The archives had shown me blueprints. The photographs had shown me destruction. but paper and pixels only go so far. At some point, you have to stand inside the thing itself, feel what is left, listen to what has not been written down. I chose a drained salt spring in southern Germany, a small site, not famous, not protected, just a forgotten well house on the edge of a village that had long since stopped caring what it was. The building was locked, but the lock was old. Metal flaked under my fingers. The door did not break with force. It yielded slowly, with patience. Inside, the air changed at once. Cool, still. Heavy with a kind of presence I could not name. The main chamber was almost perfectly circular, maybe 10 meters across. The ceiling rose into a dome, cracked now, but still holding its shape. At the very center lay a dry basin, lined with stones worn smooth by centuries of brine. The floor around it showed faint discoloration, a ghost of water lines that had not seen liquid in a long time. I stood at the edge and just listened. Silence. But not an empty silence. It was the kind that has weight, that presses lightly against your ears, that makes you feel as if the room is waiting for something to happen. I clapped my hands once. The sound did not bounce back in a messy echo. It rang, a clear bell-like tone that hung in the air for several seconds before sinking into a lower hum, a vibration I felt more in my chest than in my ears. The chamber was tuned. Someone had built this space to resonate at a specific frequency. The dome, the ratios, the thickness of the walls, the choice of stone, none of it random. All of it calibrated to create this exact acoustic effect. I thought about the singing wells I had read about in local legends, the healing vapors said to rise from salt springs, stories of people walking for days just to sit and breathe in rooms like this one. What if those were not just superstitions and folklore? What if the chambers really did something to the body, to the air, to the water that once filled them? I stayed in that room for almost an hour, measuring, photographing, recording audio. I would later run through analysis tools to see what frequencies were being amplified and which ones were being swallowed. As I worked, something else caught my eye. Thin channels in the floor, hairline grooves carved into the stone, radiating out from the central basin toward the walls like spokes. Too straight to be natural, too consistent to be decoration. Where did they go? I followed one groove all the way to the wall. It vanished into a narrow seam between stones. A seam that had been filled with mortar, not ancient mortar, fresh, different color, different texture, maybe 50 years old, maybe less. Well, within living memory, someone had sealed this chamber, recently, not in 1890, not during the era of big demolitions and modernization, but in a time when cameras already existed, when archives were organized, when somebody had to sign a piece of paper to authorize the work. The system had not only been destroyed and then forgotten, it was still being managed, still being covered, still being actively hidden, even now, which meant someone still knew what these places were. Someone still considered them dangerous enough to block, to mute, to close. Someone was still curating the silence, and that realization changed everything. Someone was still managing the silence, but you cannot erase a continental system completely. You can seal chambers, you can fill channels, you can demolish domes and rewrite histories. You cannot move cities, and cities remember what they were built on. I went back to my maps with new eyes, not searching for the old network itself anymore, but for its ghost, the shadow it had cast on the modern world. What I found had been hiding in plain sight. I started with the highway systems of Europe, the major arteries that tie capitals and industrial hubs together. I laid them over my salt grid. The match was impossible to ignore. Autoroutes, autobahns, motorways. They did not just cross the old salt paths at random. They ran along them, sometimes almost exactly. Kilometer after kilometer, great bands of asphalt traced the same lines where brine had once flowed. You could call that coincidence. Engineers follow natural routes, valleys, passes, river corridors. That is the official logic. But then I looked at the railways. The first rail networks, those early lines from the 1830s, 1840s, 1850s, linked the salt nodes with eerie precision, before heavy industry demanded those exact connections, before population numbers justified such routes. The rails went where the salt grid went, as if someone were rebuilding the same system in iron instead of brine. I dug deeper, electrical grids, telecommunications lines, fiber optic cables. Again and again, the same corridors appeared, the same nodes, the same geometry. Modern utilities were not carving fresh paths across the continent. They were following the ghost of something far older. Then I turned to the cities themselves, to their street plans, their underground layers, their forgotten infrastructure. In Vienna, metro stations line up with documented salt depot locations. In Munich, buried passages link points that were once brine channels. In Paris, sections of the catacombs follow routes that predate any recorded construction, mirroring the old grid in stone. We built our present world on bones we do not acknowledge. Every day, millions of people move along paths laid down by the salt network. They descend into metro stations placed on top of hydraulic nodes. They drive highways that trace ancient brine channels. They live in cities shaped by a geometry they were never taught to see. The network is dead, but its skeleton still decides where we go, how we move, where we gather. The ghost is still guiding us, and once I noticed it, once the pattern clicked into place, I could not unsee it. Every map became a palimpsest, old lines bleeding through the new ink. Every city plan felt like a confession, half erased and written over. The old system was not simply erased, it was overwritten, covered with asphalt, steel, and strands of glass carrying light. Layer after layer laid down on top of the same invisible template. But the template is still there, still shaping everything. Which left me with one more question. If this much survived in the open, how many other fragments are still intact, hiding in the few places nobody ever bothered to modernize? What other fragments remained intact? Not every node was demolished. Not every chamber was sealed. Some places, through luck, neglect, or geography, slipped past the great dismantling. I went looking for the survivors. They were harder to track down than I expected. Not because they were gone, but because they had been renamed, repackaged, filed away under labels that drained them of meaning. Tourist attraction, cultural heritage site, historical monument. Words that turn a machine into a museum piece. Words that tell you to admire, not to understand. But I was done admiring. I was measuring, comparing, hunting for the fingerprints of the original builders. And I found them. In the Turda salt mine in Romania, a vast underground complex now dressed up with concerts, amusement rides, and a Ferris wheel spinning under the earth. Tourists float in boats and ride glowing gondolas beneath a ceiling carved with strict, repeating geometry. They do not ask who shaped this void, why the acoustics are almost perfectly balanced, or why its proportions mirror chambers carved thousands of kilometers away. In Salina Turda's main hall, I measured the same angles I had seen in Velichka, the same ratios I had mapped at Arche Sinan, the same relationship between height, width, and dome curvature that keeps reappearing like a signature. Different country, different supposed era, same mathematics. In the Cardona salt caves of Spain, I found walls laced with carved channels that serve no clear mining purpose. Geometric patterns etched into rock salt. Patterns that match symbols I had seen in old Tartarian engravings and atlases. In the Kira salt mine in Pakistan, one of the oldest salt sites on record, I walked through chambers with domed ceilings, carved pillars, and underground pools set at exact intervals along an invisible grid. The official story shrugs and calls it natural formation enhanced by miners. But natural formations do not arrange themselves according to sacred geometry. The survivors shared something beyond their architecture. They shared a feeling. Standing in these spaces, surrounded by walls of salt that have watched centuries pass, I felt a resonance I struggle to put into ordinary words, a low hum beneath perception, as if the chambers were still waiting for a signal, as if they remained wired into a system that no longer flows, but has not completely died. The builders left their signature everywhere: precise proportions, recurring angles, the constant marriage of water, salt, and stone, domes that gather and focus sound, basins that catch and bend light, geometry that seems designed to collect something our modern language has no term for. These were not just mines, they were temples. Temples to a technology we have forgotten, a science we have dismissed, a civilization we have scraped out of the story. But the stones remember, and standing among them, I finally understood what I was mourning. Not only the loss of knowledge, the loss of an entire world, a lost world. I had spent months tracing its outline, mapping its skeleton, walking through the chambers that somehow survived. Now it was time to face the question that started everything. Why was salt worth gold? The usual answer never added up. Preservation, flavor, taxes. None of that explained the violence, the fortresses, the continent-spanning infrastructure, the wars that lasted for centuries. But now I had a different answer. Salt was not just a commodity. It was a component. The key element in a hydraulic system that moved energy across continents without coal, without steam, without electricity. A system that used brine density, water pressure, and precise geometry to do something our modern world barely knows how to describe. Think about what that means. A civilization that could draw power from salt and gravity, that could send force through underground channels stretching for thousands of miles, that could build self-running systems that needed no fuel, no combustion, no smoke, clean energy, silent energy, invisible energy, flowing through the earth like blood through veins. And salt was the blood. Change the salinity, and the density differences collapse, lose the precise concentrations, and the pressure systems fail. Cut off the supply to key nodes, and the entire network goes dark. Control the salt, control the power. Lose the salt, lose everything. Suddenly, the violence makes sense. Those fortresses were not just guarding a trade good, they were guarding power plants. Those taxes were not only about income, they were tools to restrict who could access energy. Those wars were never really about seasoning. They were about deciding who would control the engine of everyday life. Salt was worth gold because salt was power, not metaphorical power, literal power. The force that moved water, turned mechanisms, lit hidden chambers, warmed buildings. The foundation of a technology so woven into daily life that whoever controlled it controlled everything built on top of it. And when that system was finally dismantled, when the channels were filled, the chambers sealed, the grid cut apart, something had to take its place. Coal, steam, oil, electricity, the new fuels, the dirty fuels. Fuels that demand extraction, combustion, waste, and tight central control. We did not climb upward from the old system. We were downgraded into the new one. The Tartarian technology was clean, distributed, and self-sustaining. Its replacement was dirty, centralized, and exhaustible. And the cost of that switch, the environmental cost, the political cost, the human cost, has never stopped. Every smokestack, every pipeline, every war for oil, all of it is the bill we are still paying for one decision. The decision to forget what salt was really for. The price of forgetting what salt was really for. I have been sitting with this knowledge for weeks now, letting it sink in, trying to understand what it means, not only for history, but for us, for this moment. We are taught that progress moves in one direction, upward, forward, from primitive to advanced, from superstition to science, from darkness to light. But what if that story is wrong? What if we did not climb out of ignorance? What if we fell into it? The Tartarian salt network, if I am right about what it was, points to something we have been trained to call impossible. A continental power system, clean, silent, self-sustaining, built on principles we now dismiss as primitive, salt and water, pressure and geometry, the physics of density and flow, no combustion, no smoke, no extraction wars, no climate collapse, just the quiet movement of brine through channels carved by people who understood something we no longer remember. And we destroyed it, not by accident, not through slow decay, through deliberate systematic dismantling, chambers sealed, channels filled, domes brought down, knowledge scrubbed from the record. Then came the replacement, coal, oil, systems that demand scarcity, conflict, and tight control. We tell ourselves we progressed, but the more I looked, the more it felt like something else. We were reset. That is what kept me awake at night. That is what held me in front of maps and photographs and engineering diagrams at 3 a.m. Not just the idea of a conspiracy, not just the sense of a cover-up, the waste, the sheer staggering waste of what was thrown away. And yet, there is one thought I keep circling back to. The stones are still there. The chambers still exist. The geometry still holds. The survivors still stand in Romania, in Poland, in Spain, in Pakistan, waiting in the half-dark, humming at frequencies we have stopped listening for. The knowledge is not completely gone. It is buried, scattered, wrapped in tourism, in heritage plaques, in half-remembered local legends. But it is there, and maybe, just maybe, it can be recovered. Not by me. I am only someone who noticed a pattern on an old map. Someone who pulled a loose thread until it revealed something vast and frightening and beautiful underneath. But by someone, by enough someones, by people who look at salt and see more than seasoning, who walk into old buildings and ask what they were really for, who refuse to believe our ancestors were stupid simply because we were told they were. The salt roads are silent now. But silence is not the same as death. Sometimes silence is waiting for someone to listen again. And maybe that is the part of history we are never taught. Not only what was lost, but what is still here, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be remembered,